The throne chamber of the eternal sovereign had been designed to inspire awe and fear in equal measure. Cathedral ceilings arched overhead, covered in bioluminescent material that cast everything in cold, clinical light. The throne itself sat atop a platform, requiring supplicants to climb 17 steps, one for each world conquered by Queen Selene Varthara personally during her reign. Selene sat upon that throne now, reviewing tactical displays projected in the air before her, while her advisors argued about the disposition of captured human vessels. The battle in the Arcturus sector had been decisive, 3 human frigates destroyed, 1 captured, minimal Alvari casualties. It should have been a perfect victory. "The prisoners should be transferred to processing facilities immediately," Lord Cavan said, his long ears swept back in the aggressive posture Alvari adopted when arguing for violence. "Standard interrogation protocols, then public execution. Send a message to the remaining resistance cells. Some may have intelligence value," Commander Thera countered. "The captured frigate's command crew should be held longer for extraction purposes." Selene listened with half her attention, the other half occupied by the strange emptiness that seemed to follow every victory lately. Another world subdued, another resistance crushed, another day of absolute power leaving her feeling absolutely nothing. "What about the pilot?" someone asked. Selene's attention sharpened. "Which pilot?" "The human who killed 17 of our warriors during the boarding action," Cavan said with barely suppressed rage. "Lieutenant Connor Drake, according to their military designation. He should be executed immediately as an example." 17. Selene interrupted. "1 human killed 17 Alvari warriors. With combat armor and defensive positioning," Commander Thera clarified. "But yes, unusual combat capability for their species." Selene felt something stir, curiosity, the first genuine interest she'd felt in months. "Bring him to me." Her advisors exchanged glances. "Majesty, he's just a pilot," Cavan protested. "Insignificant rank, no strategic value. He killed 17 of my warriors. I want to see what drives that kind of resistance." Selene's tone brooked no argument. "Bring him here now." 20 minutes later, the throne chamber doors dilated open, and 2 Alvari guards escorted the human prisoner inside. He wore full combat armor, scarred and burn-marked from battle, the bulky helmet obscuring his face. His hands were bound, but he walked steadily, showing no signs of the injuries Selene knew he must have sustained. The guards forced him to his knees at the base of the throne platform. He didn't resist, but something in his posture suggested the compliance was a choice rather than submission. Selene studied him from her elevated position. The armor was crude by Alvari standards, but effective. It had kept him alive long enough to kill 17 of her best warriors. She tried to imagine what kind of human wore that armor, what face lay beneath that helmet. "Remove your helmet," she commanded in standard. The human didn't move. The guards raised their plasma weapons warningly. Cavan stepped forward. "The Queen gave you an order, human. Comply or we'll remove it along with your head." Slowly, deliberately, the human reached up with his bound hands and disengaged the helmet seals. The hiss of equalizing pressure echoed in the silent chamber. He lifted the helmet off, and Selene finally saw the face of her enemy. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-20s by human aging standards, though their short lifespans made age difficult to judge. Dark hair matted from the helmet, minor injuries marking his face, a cut above one eye, bruising along his jaw. His eyes were an unusual shade of blue-green that seemed to catch the bioluminescent light. But it wasn't his features that made Selene's prepared speech die in her throat. It was the way he looked at her. Not with hatred, though he had every reason to hate the queen who'd conquered his people. Not with fear, though he stood prisoner before someone who could order his death with a word. Not with the calculating assessment she'd seen in countless enemies trying to find weakness to exploit. He looked at her with pity. And beneath that, something worse, profound disappointment. as if he'd hoped for something better and been let down by what he found. Selene had spent 15 years commanding the Alvari Empire. She'd faced down assassination attempts, crushed rebellions, expanded her territory through ruthless efficiency. Thousands had looked at her with fear, with hatred, with awe. No one had ever looked at her with pity. The silence stretched. Her advisors shifted uncomfortably. The guards maintained their weapons training. And this human, this prisoner, this enemy who'd killed 17 of her warriors, met her eyes with an expression that said he saw past the throne and the crown and the empire to something she'd spent her entire life hiding. He saw her loneliness. "I asked for your name," Selene said, her voice coming out harsher than she'd intended because something in his gaze had rattled her. "Lieutenant Connor Drake, 2nd Fleet Arcturus Defense Force," he said calmly. His standard was accented but clear. "Serial number 7749 Delta 6. I don't care about your military designation." Selene leaned forward, trying to regain the psychological advantage his expression had somehow stolen. "I want to know why one human killed 17 of my warriors. What drives that kind of desperate resistance?" Connor was quiet for a moment, still holding her gaze with that unnerving directness. "The same thing that drives you," he said finally. "The belief that what we're fighting for matters more than what it costs. And what are you fighting for? Your resistance is futile. We have superior numbers, superior technology. We're fighting to exist as ourselves rather than as subjects of your empire," Connor interrupted gently. "And you're right, we'll probably lose. But the cost we inflict might make you question whether conquest is worth the price." "That's not how empires work," Selene said coldly. "We don't question, we escalate until victory is achieved." "I know." That expression again, pity and disappointment. "That's what makes it tragic. You dare judge me." Selene stood, her voice echoing in the chamber. "You, a soldier from a species that can barely survive beyond your home system, presume to judge an empire that has brought order to 47 worlds." "I'm not judging your empire," Connor said quietly. "I'm observing what it's cost you, and wondering if you've noticed yet." The throne chamber was absolutely silent. Selene's advisors looked shocked that the prisoner was still speaking, let alone saying things that bordered on treasonous insolence. The guards tightened their grips on weapons, waiting for the execution order. But Selene couldn't look away from those blue-green eyes that saw too much. "What exactly do you think it's cost me?" she demanded. "Everything that matters," Connor said. "Look around this room. You're surrounded by advisors who fear you, guards who obey you, subjects who bow to you. But who actually knows you? Who sees you as more than the crown you wear? Who would mourn your death as a person, rather than scrambling for succession?" The words hit like physical blows because they articulated something Selene had felt but never acknowledged. The profound isolation of absolute power. The loneliness of being feared rather than known. "Guards," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Take the prisoner to secure holding, not the execution cells, individual quarters." Cavan stepped forward, his ears rigid with displeasure. "Majesty, this human is dangerous. He's one wounded soldier against an entire dreadnought of warriors. I think we can manage the security risk." Selene turned her back on Connor, a dismissal. "I'm not finished understanding what drives his resistance. He'll be held for further interrogation." She heard the guards hauling Connor to his feet, heard their footsteps as they escorted him out. Didn't turn around until the doors had sealed behind them. Then she sank back onto her throne and stared at the empty space where the human had knelt, trying to understand why his pity had shaken her more than any threat or insult ever could. Cavan approached cautiously. "Majesty, with respect, keeping the human alive is..." "Dismissed," Selene said flatly. "All of you, I want the chamber cleared." Her advisors exchanged worried glances but obeyed. Within minutes, Selene was alone in the vast throne room, surrounded by the symbols of her power and feeling more isolated than she'd ever felt in her life. Because a human prisoner had looked at her and seen what no one else had ever acknowledged. that she'd built an empire and lost herself in the process. And the worst part was that he looked disappointed, as if he'd expected better from her, as if he thought she could be more than what she'd become. The thought was absurd, dangerous. She should have ordered his execution immediately. Instead, she activated the surveillance feed for his holding cell and watched him remove his armor with methodical care, tending to injuries that should have made him weak but somehow didn't. And she wondered what it would be like to have someone look at her not with fear or hatred, but with the kind of clear-eyed understanding that said they saw her, really saw her, and thought she might be worth knowing. The thought terrified her, which was exactly why she couldn't look away. 3 days passed before Selene acknowledged what everyone in her command structure had already noticed. She was obsessed with the human prisoner. She reviewed surveillance footage of his cell with frequency that would embarrass her if anyone knew the exact numbers. She read the medical reports on his injuries. She analyzed the combat recordings from the boarding action, watching him fight with a combination of tactical precision and desperate creativity that her military training couldn't quite categorize. Connor Drake didn't behave like a defeated enemy. He maintained discipline, exercising daily despite injuries, keeping his cell orderly, maintaining what routines he could manage in captivity. But he also did things that made no tactical sense. He sang sometimes, songs in languages the translation software couldn't parse. He drew pictures on the walls using the condensation from the environmental systems. He spent hours sitting quietly, staring at nothing with an expression that Selene recognized because she'd worn it herself in private moments. Profound weariness with the endless cycle of violence. On the 4th day, Selene made a decision that would horrify her security chief if he knew. She went to Connor's cell alone. "Majesty, I must protest," Commander Thera began when Selene dismissed the guards, noted and overruled. "Wait outside. If I'm not out in 30 minutes, you may enter and execute the prisoner for attacking me." Selene's tone made it clear the discussion was over. She entered the cell and Connor stood immediately, a gesture of respect that surprised her. Most prisoners either cowered or tried to posture dominance. He did neither, just acknowledged her presence with the same measured calm he'd shown in the throne room. "You can sit," Selene said, taking the room's only chair, a subtle power play. "I prefer to stand if it's all the same to you," Connor said politely. "It's not all the same to me. Sit." He sat on the sleeping platform, maintaining eye contact in a way that would be insubordinate among Alvari, but somehow didn't feel disrespectful. "You killed 17 of my warriors," Selene said, deciding to start with facts rather than the uncomfortable questions his gaze raised. 16 during the boarding action, one more who died from injuries afterward." "I know," Connor said quietly. "I remember each of their faces." The admission surprised her. She'd expected justification or deflection. "You don't try to excuse it, claim it was necessary combat." "It was necessary to protect my crew, but that doesn't make it right or erase what I took from those warriors and their families." He met her eyes. "They had lives, futures, people who cared about them. I ended that. The fact that we're at war doesn't change that reality." Selene found herself off balance again. "Then why fight at all? Your resistance is futile. Every battle costs you resources you can't replace, lives you can't spare. We fight because the alternative is accepting subjugation." Connor's voice was calm but firm. "And yes, we'll probably lose, but we can make it costly enough that maybe you'll question whether conquest is worth the price. Empires don't work that way. We don't retreat because of cost." "I know," Connor interrupted gently. "You escalate, you overwhelm, you never question whether the goal justifies the methods. I understand how empires work." "Then why look at me like you're disappointed? Why that expression in the throne room, as if you'd hoped for better?" The question came out more vulnerable than Selene intended, but Connor didn't exploit the opening. Instead, he considered thoughtfully before answering. "Because I saw something in you that you're not letting yourself acknowledge. You're brilliant, Your tactical decisions show that. You're capable of compassion. You gave me individual quarters instead of the execution cells. But you've built walls so high around yourself that you're imprisoned by your own empire. I'm the Empress. I have absolute power. And absolute isolation, Connor said. Power without connection is just a gilded cage. I've seen it before, in commanders who prioritized mission over humanity. They won battles but lost themselves. You presume to know what I've lost. I presume nothing, I observe. He gestured around the cell. You come here alone, dismissing guards, risking your security to talk to a prisoner who should mean nothing to you. Why? Selene could have lied, could have claimed strategic intelligence gathering or psychological warfare. Instead, she found herself telling the truth. Because no one else looks at me the way you did. Everyone sees the crown, the power, the empire you saw. She paused, struggling with words. You saw me. And I can't remember the last time anyone did that. That must be lonely, Connor said, and the gentleness in his voice made something crack in Selene's carefully maintained composure. Loneliness is irrelevant. I serve my empire. And who serves you? The question was soft but devastating. Who checks if you're okay? Who cares whether you're happy or just functional? Who knows you as a person instead of a position? The answer was no one, and they both knew it. Selene stood abruptly, turning away because she couldn't maintain her composure while he looked at her with that understanding. This conversation is inappropriate. Probably, Connor agreed. But you came here for a reason, and it wasn't to interrogate me about military intelligence. He was right. She'd come because for 3 days, she'd been unable to stop thinking about those moments in the throne room when someone finally saw past her armor. Why did you look at me with pity? She asked, still not turning around. In the throne room, why pity instead of hatred or fear? Because I recognize something in you that I've felt myself, Connor said. After you lose enough people, it becomes easier to stop connecting. Easier to focus on duty and mission and let everything else fall away. You build walls to protect yourself from more loss, and eventually you realize you've built a prison. And you think that's what I've done. I think you've spent your entire life being told that emotion is weakness, that connection is vulnerability, that a good ruler stands alone. And I think you've built an empire on those principles, while slowly suffocating under the weight of isolation. Selene turned back to face him. You know nothing about my life. No, Connor acknowledged, but I know about loneliness. I know what it feels like to have people around you constantly but no one who actually knows you. I know how exhausting it is to maintain a mask every moment of every day. He paused. And I know that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is admit you're tired. I can't afford to be tired, the empire will continue whether you acknowledge your humanity or not. The question is whether you'll survive the empire, or whether it will consume you completely. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Selene wasn't ready to examine. She'd come to understand the prisoner who'd killed her warriors, and found instead someone who understood her in ways no one else had even attempted. This interrogation is over, she said, moving toward the door. It wasn't really an interrogation, Connor observed. You didn't ask about resistance tactics, fleet movements, strategic intelligence. You asked about why I looked at you a certain way. Selene paused at the door, hand on the release. And if I did, what does that tell you? That somewhere underneath the crown and the empire, there's a person who wants to be seen. And that terrifies you. She left without responding, but his words followed her like shadows. Over the following weeks, an impossible pattern established itself. He described Earth before the wars, when humanity was fractured and chaotic but vibrantly alive. He talked about music, showing her recordings from his personal files that the guards had overlooked, sounds that Alvari culture classified as frivolous noise, but that Connor described with reverence usually reserved for sacred things. And Selene, despite every instinct screaming that this was dangerous, found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, about the loneliness of absolute power, about her father's brutal reign and the lessons he'd taught about strength requiring emotional suppression, about the fact that she had advisors and subjects and an entire empire, but not one person she could call friend. "That's not living," Connor said during one conversation. "That's just existing with imperial decoration." "And what would you know about living?" Selene challenged. "You're a soldier in a losing war, facing execution or permanent imprisonment." "Right now, yes, but I've lived." His expression softened with memory. "I've loved people. I've created things, music, art, moments of connection that mattered more than any strategic victory. I've sat around fires with friends and laughed until I couldn't breathe. I've chosen messy, complicated connection over safe isolation. And where did that get you? Captured, imprisoned, waiting to die. It got me 30 years of being fully alive instead of existing as a function of empire," Connor said. "When I die, tomorrow or 50 years from now, I'll die knowing I was a person who mattered to other people. Not just a designation or a role, but someone who was known and valued for being myself." The words haunted Selene for days afterward. She began noticing things about her life she'd never questioned. The advisors who approached with calculated deference, never genuine warmth. The subjects who bowed but never smiled. The complete absence of anyone who would mourn her death as a person, rather than scrambling for political advantage in the succession crisis. She ruled 47 worlds and had nothing real. The crisis came on a day that started like any other. Selene was reviewing expansion proposals when the ship-wide alarm sounded, security breach in the cargo decks. A human resistance cell had infiltrated through a supply convoy, and they were moving through the Eternal Sovereign's corridors with clear purpose: assassinate the Queen. Selene's security team moved her to the throne chamber, establishing defensive perimeters while warriors hunted the infiltrators. It should have been routine. Resistance cells had tried assassination before, always failed. But something about this attempt felt different, more coordinated. "Majesty, we've cornered 3 of the infiltrators, but we're reading at least 2 more still mobile," Commander Thera reported, her weapon ready. "They're moving toward the secure holding sections." Selene's blood went cold. "Connor, the human prisoner, is not their target. He knows resistance tactics. If they free him, he could help them navigate the ship." It was a logical concern, but Selene knew her fear was more personal. The thought of Connor being killed in crossfire, or worse, being freed and immediately leaving, made her chest tight. "Guards are posted at his cell," Thera assured her. Then the communication feed crackled with panic. "Secure holding under attack. Multiple guards down." The feed cut to static. Selene made a decision that would horrify her council. "I'm going there." "Majesty, absolutely not." "That's an order, Commander. You'll escort me with full security, but I'm going to that holding area. Now." The corridors were chaos. Warriors running to defensive positions, alerts blaring, the ship's AI tracking intruders through sensor networks. Selene moved through it with Thera and 6 elite guards, heading toward the secure holding section. They arrived to find bodies, both Alvari guards and human infiltrators, evidence of fierce fighting. Connor's cell was breached, the door blown open by shaped charges. Selene's heart stopped. He was gone, either freed by the resistance or killed in the fighting. "Majesty, movement." She spun to see Connor emerging from the smoke, his hands somehow free of restraints, supporting an injured Alvari guard. He was limping badly, blood streaming from a head wound, but his focus was on the guard. "She needs medical attention," he said to Selene, as if it were perfectly normal for a prisoner to be helping his captors. "Took shrapnel when they breached the door." Thera's weapon snapped up, targeting Connor. "Step away from the guard." "Commander, wait," Selene said, staring at Connor in disbelief. "What happened here?" "Resistance cell tried to free me," Connor explained, lowering the injured guard carefully. "I refused. Told them I wasn't leaving, that this assassination attempt was strategically pointless and morally wrong." He grimaced. "They didn't take it well, started fighting the guards and he gestured at the carnage. I helped defend your people instead. Why? The question burst from Selene. They were your people coming to rescue you. They were my former comrades making a mistake that would only make things worse, Connor corrected. Killing you would just put someone more hardline in power, and he met her eyes. And you're starting to question the empire you inherited. I've seen it in our conversations. You're changing, thinking differently. That's worth more than my freedom. Selene stared at this human who'd chosen to protect his captors over his own liberation, and something fundamental shifted in her understanding of strength and loyalty. Medical team to secure holding, she commanded. Then, to Connor. You're bleeding. I've had worse, he said with a slight smile. Then his legs gave out and Selene caught him before her guards could react. She held him, this enemy, this prisoner, this impossible person who'd somehow become the center of her tightly controlled world, and made a decision that would change everything. Commander Thera, the prisoner is to be transferred to guest quarters immediately. Full medical care, no restraints. Majesty, the security risk is mine to manage. He just saved Alvari lives at the cost of his own freedom. That deserves recognition, not imprisonment. Selene looked down at Connor, who was fading from blood loss but still conscious. And perhaps it's time I learned from someone who understands that strength and compassion aren't mutually exclusive. Connor smiled before unconsciousness took him. Took you long enough to figure that out. Connor woke in quarters that were definitely not a cell. Actual furniture, windows showing the nebula outside. Medical equipment humming quietly beside the bed, where Alvari physicians had treated his injuries. And Queen Selene Varthara sitting in a chair beside that bed, looking exhausted and vulnerable in ways he'd never seen. You stayed, he said, his voice rough. You defended my guards when you could have escaped, Selene replied. That seemed worth acknowledging. I told you, killing you would make things worse. No, you could have left without participating in the assassination. Let my guards handle it while you took the freedom offered. Selene leaned forward. You chose to fight for people who have kept you prisoner. Why? Connor considered the question carefully. Because I've come to care what happens to you, not as a queen or an empress, but as a person who's starting to question the walls she's built. And because, he paused, because I've seen who you could be in our conversations. Someone who leads with wisdom instead of just power. Someone who might change an empire from the inside out. That's impossible. Probably, Connor agreed. But humans are good at impossible things. Selene laughed, a genuine sound Connor had never heard from her. My advisors want you executed more than ever. You're too dangerous, too much influence on my recent decisions. And what do you want? I want. Selene stopped, chose vulnerability over safety. I want to understand how you look at an empire built on fear and see potential for something better. I want to learn how to lead without sacrificing every human connection. I want, her voice cracked slightly. I want to stop being alone, and I don't know how without dismantling everything I am. Connor reached out, took her hand despite the species difference and power imbalance. You start by choosing differently, not all at once. Small choices, like pardoning guards who were coerced, like listening to perspectives that challenge yours, like admitting you don't have all the answers. If I make those choices, I'll be seen as weak, challenged, possibly overthrown. Maybe, Connor acknowledged, but is maintaining absolute power worth never being known, never being loved instead of feared? Selene was quiet for a long moment, staring at their joined hands. Alvari and human, conqueror and conquered, two people who should be enemies but had somehow become something else entirely. I don't know how to be anything other than what I was raised to be, she admitted. A weapon, a tool of empire. Neither did I for a long time. Military family, raised on duty and sacrifice. Connor squeezed her hand gently. It took losing people I loved to realize that duty without connection is just slow death. So I learned to let people in, to be vulnerable. And I found that the people worth knowing didn't need me to be perfect. They just needed me to be real. I don't know if I can do that. You just did, Connor pointed out. You admitted you don't know how. That's vulnerability. That's real. Selene felt tears threatening, an emotional display no Alvari monarch should show, and didn't try to stop them. I can't free you. My council would see it as weakness. I know, but I can't kill you either. You've become. She struggled for words. The only person who sees me as more than my crown. I can't lose that. Then we find a third option, Connor said. We change things gradually. Use my presence as unofficial advisor to shift policy toward negotiation instead of pure conquest. Show your empire that strength can include compassion. That will take years, decades possibly. I'm not going anywhere, Connor said with a slight smile. Where would I go? Back to a war I no longer believe in. Back to resistance tactics that cost lives without changing anything fundamental. He met her eyes. Or I could stay here and help you build something new. An empire that makes space for different voices. That leads through wisdom instead of just force. You do that, help the empire that conquered your people. I do it to help you become the leader you're capable of being. And maybe, in the process, turn an empire into something worth belonging to. Selene sat with that offer, understanding its impossibility and its necessity. Then she made a choice that would define everything that followed. Then stay, not as prisoner but as. She paused, searching for the right term. As someone who reminds me that empires are made of people, not just resources. Someone who helps me remember to be human, Alvari, whatever. To be a person instead of just a crown. I can do that, Connor said. Though fair warning, I'm going to challenge you, question your assumptions. Make you uncomfortable when you revert to old patterns. Good, Selene said and meant it. I need that. They sat together in the quiet of the medical quarters, two people from opposite sides of an impossible divide, and began the slow work of building something unprecedented. It would take years. Selene would face resistance from hardline advisors who saw her reforms as weakness. Connor would navigate the impossible space of being human among Alvari, advising an empire that had devastated his people while working toward peace. There would be setbacks and struggles, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves and new approaches failed. But gradually, the empire began to shift. Conquered worlds received more autonomy. Punitive measures decreased. Negotiations replaced automatic subjugation. And at the center of it all, Selene learned to lead with authority that didn't require fear, guided by someone who'd seen her loneliness and chosen to stand beside her anyway. 5 years after Connor first removed his helmet in the throne chamber, the Eternal Sovereign hosted peace negotiations with the human resistance. The war that had seemed endless was concluding not through total victory, but through negotiated settlement. Connor stood beside Selene's throne during the signing ceremony, not as prisoner or even formal advisor, but as the person who'd helped her understand that true strength included the courage to change. When visiting dignitaries questioned why a human stood so close to the Alvari throne, Selene's answer was simple. Because he showed me that the strongest empires aren't built on fear. They're built on the courage to admit when you're wrong, to learn from unlikely sources, and to choose connection over control. Connor added with characteristic humor, also because someone needs to tell her when she's being too much of an empress and not enough of a person. Full-time job. That evening, after the dignitaries had departed and the ship quieted into night cycle, Selene found Connor in the observation deck, looking out at the nebula that had witnessed their impossible journey. "Remove your helmet," she said softly. Connor turned, smiling because he hadn't worn combat armor in years, but he understood what she meant, the echo of that first meeting when everything had changed. "I'm not wearing one," he pointed out. "I know, but I wanted to remember that moment, when I ordered you to remove it and saw your face and everything I thought I knew about strength and weakness collapsed." Connor moved closer, took her hand in his. "What did you see that changed things?" compassion where I expected hatred, understanding where I expected judgment, and someone who looked at my loneliness and didn't exploit it, just acknowledged it and offered connection instead. And now I see the person who helped me become someone I can respect, who stood beside me through impossible change, who chose to help me build something better instead of just escaping to something easier. They stood together in the nebula's light, two people who should have been enemies but had become something deeper than friendship, stronger than alliance. Not quite lovers, the complications of species and history made that fraught, but partners in the truest sense. Do you ever regret it? Connor asked. Choosing this path instead of pure conquest, it would have been simpler. Simple isn't the same as right, Selene said. And no, I don't regret it. An empire built on fear would have crumbled eventually. We're building something that might actually last, something based on consent instead of coercion. Still a lot of work ahead. Always will be, Selene agreed. But I'm not facing it alone anymore. That makes